All right. Let's take a look at a few more Catholic authors before we get all the way into the Protestants. All right, loading up, and yes, okay. So, one guy I want to mention is Sir Thomas More. Now, Thomas More is a very interesting dude. He's very complex. He's got a lot going on to him. First off, one of his claims to fame is that he was a guy who basically told Henry VIII to F off. Henry VIII, as we will recall, he started a whole church just because he wanted to divorce his wife. And largely because he didn't have any sons. So he started a whole new religion. Now, in practice, in England, this became a very significant thing. England eventually took pride in being very Protestant and having its own church. But back in the time of Sir Thomas More, that was much more dicey of a proposition. So Henry said, hey, Thomas, convert from Catholicism to Protestantism, to Anglicanism. And More said, no, I won't. So he was executed by Henry VIII, who loved executing people, executed a bunch of his wives. So More, from this perspective, More seems very Catholic, He is rejecting he's rejecting this idea of this new Protestant religion, and he's playing it safe. He's sticking with the church. And he is sort of a martyr for Catholicism in certain ways. He's not a saint, but, he goes down in history as someone who died for his beliefs. On the other hand, More's other claim to fame is the book Utopia, which is very decidedly not as Catholic, or at least it doesn't seem to be. It's very different. So Utopia, what comes to mind? We probably think of some sort of perfect paradisical place of peace, right? A society where everything is perfect. That's one meaning of the word utopia. That would be if we interpret it according to Greek, in which it would be good place, a place that is good. How do you build a society that is good? But another way of interpreting it is according to Latin, in which it would be that you would mean no or not. So utopia in that sense would be not a place or nowhere, no place. So in Utopia, Sir Thomas More is describing a society that is kind of, the question is it the good place that we want to make, or is it a no place, an impossible place that could never exist? That's kind of the question, and people are still debating the interpretation of his work. But the features of this society are very interesting. So first off, the thing it's probably most comparable to is Plato's Republic, where he also tries to build the perfect society. But Plato is thinking of a city, and Plato divides everybody up into social hierarchy. The smartest people will be the leaders, more or less, and then there will be the workers, and so on and so forth. People will play these different roles, and there will be an inherent three-part class structure: the gold, silver, and bronze people. Whereas Thomas More, he has less of that sort of class influence, more of an open-minded society. And where in Plato they have like these sort of watchdogs, this watchdog class to keep everybody else in line. In Utopia, this society, everybody is responsible for justice. It's sort of a shared responsibility, which is a much more modern way of thinking about things. And it kind of resembles a little bit of the philosophy of politics we're going to see in the Enlightenment later on, which is very interesting. Other things about this society, it's an island. So it's not really a city, it's just an island filled up with people, which kind of resembles Plato's mythical Atlantis almost. That's probably an influence on there. And in there, it's kind of socialist, honestly. There's no private property. Everybody just holds everything in common, and similar to how all the moral responsibilities are held in common. There are also a lot of cute features, like these guys despise wealth. And part of that is because they've done a propaganda campaign. They make all their chamber pots and other similarly disgusting things out of gold, so that nobody in the society desires gold. They just think it's ugly and gross, which is genius, honestly. We should try that in our society with things that we are too interested in. But yeah, so it's a society that's very much more, it's not a capitalist sort of thing. It's not very, Protestant work ethic. It's very much chill and down to earth, this society. Now the question is, how much does he really mean this? Because these people in this imaginary society are not Catholic at all. They're very un-Catholic. They're worshiping the sun and the moon. And he's like, yeah, that's fine. At least in the book, he's like, that's fine. And so people have wondered, what parts of this are satire? Is some part of it a parody in some way? Saying some sort of extreme thing or a silly thing that's to be mocked. Is he saying the whole thing is impossible, we should never believe in it? That's the one extreme. Or is he really genuinely being like, yeah, it's okay if people aren't Catholic? What kind of philosophy does he have? We're still trying to figure him out. Is he the type of guy who devoutly believed in Catholicism, but in this story he could sort of, because it's fictional, he could suspend his disbelief? Or was he mostly just rejecting Henry VIII's weird church and was less inclined towards Catholicism than he appeared? It's a lot to think about. But one way of interpreting it is that, this no place is doing better than the Christian communities. He's saying, if these pagans have their act together and are able to run the society so well, why couldn't we Christians do the same thing? Why can't we get our act together? This should galvanize us to be better than these pagans. That's one way of thinking about it anyway. But yeah, fascinating guy. Whatever way you slice it, he's very interested definitely in morality. And so this work, Utopia, regardless of how he meant it, is right up there with Plato's Republic as being one of the works that inspired people to think about how should we design a society? What should society even look like? What even is society? All those questions there. And he gave us some ideas on how to work with that. So very interesting guy. The other main Catholic I want to mention in terms of literature is Cervantes. And Cervantes was a Spanish language author. So, how More and Erasmus were kind of promoting German and English writing respectively. They were putting those languages on the literary scene to be the equals of Italian, which had come onto the literary scene to say, oh, we're equal to Latin. Well, now Spanish is joining the ranks with Don Quixote. So Don Quixote is arguably the first Spanish language novel, and it's a very fun, weird one. Basically, if you haven't heard the story before, maybe you have, it's about a sort of middle-aged to old guy who decides his life is lacking adventure, so he decides to become a knight and go off on quests. Except that he is totally delusional in a lot of ways. And so he'll do things like he sees a bunch of windmills turning and he thinks that they are giants with their arms out to attack him. So he goes and he fights the windmills with his lance and his horse. And meanwhile, his friend Sancho Panza is just sort of acting as his squire, and he sees what's really going on, and he's just sort of accompanying through all of this and trying to make sure he doesn't get too hurt. So that's Don Quixote. But I think there's some things we can notice about this is that the sort of noble ideal of the knights is pretty much going away at this point. It's dying if we can parody it so much. At the very least, people don't believe in it as strongly as they used to, because it's like, this is not the time or the place for this noble knight who acts with chivalry. People don't believe in that stuff anymore. And he's an absurd figure. He's a knight who is silly rather than, serious. That's a big shift, I think. And maybe it shows that the power of those sort of medieval knights had already been broken up pretty severely by this point, with the peasant rebellions, with the rejection of the lords, with the sort of new power of the middle class and the merchants and the mercenaries. All of that world had gone away. At least that's the argument. And I should point out that, again, we're seeing satire. We've had 3 satires in a row from these Renaissance humanist Catholics. Of course, Spain is still Catholic today, but it's all satire. And so this is continuing that sort of meta-level analysis of society and being willing to just sort of make fun of old traditions and look at things in new ways. That's pretty different. The other big claim to fame of Cervantes is is that he is one of the first authors to respond to his own fan fiction. Don Quixote came out in 2 parts, and in the second part, he ridicules unauthorized like fanfics of Don Quixote that had been put out there. Of course, this is before real copyright law, so it's not quite the same thing, but people were basically making their own authorized versions of Don Quixote because they liked it so much. And he has the characters read some of this and say, no, 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 this is not how it happened in his part 2, and he mocks that too. So yeah, just that their parody can be a thing. That's interesting. That's coming along now, and it sort of relies on this sort of higher level awareness of society. And you know, these characters are all saying and these stories are all saying something about society and about what should we be and what should we strive for. They're very individualistic, you know, and they're concerned with things like good and evil, and you know, what makes a good person. All of that suggests sort of the influence of the Renaissance on these writers. Okay, now we can finally get into the Protestants. So there's a couple of different Protestants I want to mention. One of them is Montaigne. So Montaigne is a very interesting guy. Here he is sort of writing in France. France was we kind of went back and forth in terms of its religious affiliation. But Montaigne writes with this perspective of, you know, trying to be open-minded and questioning old authority, which is, again, a theme that comes out of the Renaissance, but then flowers in the time of Martin Luther. And Montaigne would be more contemporary with Martin Luther. So Montaigne invented the essay, which may be of interest to you guys next time you're writing an essay. But in his mind, the way he thought about it was a little bit different from the idea of submitting something to be graded. An essay for him was a experimental piece of writing. And the word essay means, it comes from a French word which means to try something out or to test something out or to try and, you know, test, prove, demonstrate something. So that was his essays, and he wrote a large collection of different essays on different topics. And he could just write about anything. You know, is sort of in the spirit of the Renaissance man who was like, I'm going to learn about all these different subjects. But whereas the Renaissance man would try and comment on like older works of art or older philosophers, Montaigne doesn't see that as a limitation. He's just like, I'm going to write about whatever I want to write about. That feels very Martin Luther to me in a way that, like, Martin Luther says, you know, my opinion matters. And Montaigne says, yeah, my opinion matters. So that's Montaigne. He puts forth his essays in the world, and he just basically shares his opinions on everything, which is something people are very accustomed to doing today, but maybe we should thank him for it a little bit. And in his writings, there's a clear influence from humanism, but he's also very willing to examine himself, think about, like, who am I? What do I believe? What do I think is good? And what do I think is evil? What are my personal experiences that I've had? You know, all of that stuff is very sort of, you know, individualistic, which we said part of that comes from the Renaissance, and part of that comes from this constant debate over whether an individual should be Protestant or Catholic. That's definitely weighing on his mind as well. And he's also very willing to be skeptical. I think that's his chief feature. Whatever people have told him, have said in the past, you know, whatever is the dogma or the orthodoxy, he's willing to question it. So he will say if he disagrees with it, and he will try and make better arguments that challenge what's being said. So one of his big essays is, one of his most famous, actually, the one that the book quotes, is On Cannibals, and it's in fact called On Cannibals. So by this time, Europe was interacting with what they called the New World, the Americas. And we're going to get into that a lot more as well. But Montaigne is interesting in that he sort of took a different tack from some of the other writers. You know, Europeans encountered some of the native cultures of the Caribbean, including cannibal cultures. And they sort of stereotype them. You know, they said, oh, they're monstrous, they're terrifying. They are, you know, evil, and we need to civilize them. Whereas Montaigne challenged that. He basically pointed out what scholars would point out today, which is like, okay, yes, they were cannibals, but that was in certain contexts and certain rituals and things like that. And maybe that's wrong, maybe that is wrong, but that doesn't mean that these people aren't human, that they don't have dignity, that they aren't worthy of respect, and that we shouldn't try to understand them on their own terms. So that's pretty different from the way other people were writing about cannibals. So that's a good example of how he was willing to think outside the box, and pretty progressive for his time period. In other ways, he was maybe not so progressive. You know, he wasn't a modern person. He didn't have modern beliefs, but in being willing to question the old ideas of things, he was really able to approach things from a different framework and, you know, have better ideas because he was willing to challenge older ideas. This is something we're going to see a lot more of in the Enlightenment time period. And sort of relatedly, you know, there is the idea of question everything. And similarly, the idea that, you know, my opinions are important. I'm going to put my ideas out into the world. That's very Enlightenment time period as well. So he's a predecessor to all of that. Okay. The other big Protestant that I want to talk about is Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, very much part of the English literary scene. But I'm mostly going to talk about him in the next video. In this video, I just want to talk about sort of the precedent of what led to Shakespeare. How did we get to Shakespeare? Well, as we discussed, Shakespeare came of age in a time where where England was rapidly flashing back and forth between Protestant and Catholic. You know, Henry VIII established it as Protestant, but then some of his successors wanted it to be Catholic. In particular, we had a lady named Mary, who was briefly Queen of England, or really not all that briefly, but for some decades, tried to reverse the Protestant Reformation in England and persecute those who were Protestant and punish them and execute them. So that's why we sometimes call her Bloody Mary. You should beware of someone named Mary who is trying to, you know, convert all the Protestants back into Catholics. But she was not the only person named Mary who was trying to convert all the Protestants back into Catholics. There was also another Mary, Mary the Queen of Scots, who was at one point a candidate for the English throne, but mostly was the Queen of Scotland. She also persecuted Protestants and tried to make everything Catholic. So this constant fighting, these two were fighting another woman named Elizabeth, and that is who ultimately won. So when Protestant, Catholic, and then finally the deal was settled, Elizabeth was in charge, the other two were out, and Elizabeth was going to be the monarch of a new era where England was firmly Protestant. And from this time onward, Protestantism became sort of part of the English cultural identity. We have our own church. We don't believe in the things that the Pope and whatnot believe. We don't follow all of that. That sort of became a marker of English identity. And it became very hard to shake that way of thinking about things. And, you know, Elizabeth was such this sort of bringer of a new era that we even name the era after her. The Elizabethan era in English history is a very important and specific time period. And that's the time period of Shakespeare. Elizabeth was one of the patrons of Shakespeare, followed by her successor, King James, who was responsible for the King James Bible. That's a very Protestant thing to do, translate the Bible into language that everybody can understand. Or at least they could understand it in that time period anyway. So both of them were very much about cultivating these sort of Protestant ideals. And Shakespeare had been through this whole process of going back and forth between Protestant and Catholic, and that shaped his thinking. But on top of that, there was also the real interest in politics. You know, what makes a good king? What makes a good queen? These are themes that we see throughout his plays. How should society work? How do you be a good leader for society? You know, these are very Renaissance themes, but they were very influential on Shakespeare as well, influenced his thinking. But part of that was because he was so intimately connected to these monarchs. These were the people who were paying him for his art and, you know, supporting him, the reason he could make a living. So if he had an interest in history a lot of the time and writing about these kings from history, he could use it to comment on these themes of politics and power, as well as these themes of religion that we talked about when we talked about Hamlet. So that's all quite interesting. And one more thing that kind of confirmed that Protestantism was finally here to stay in people's minds was the defeat of the Spanish Armada. So, Spain is this, as we saw, is still this Catholic country, whereas England was going full Protestant, and they basically had a war over it. And to everybody's surprise, the new underdogs, these Protestants, won. And so the English felt very good about that and very secure about their place in the world and their identity. They could be powerful, and that Protestantism was on the way up. At least to the English, it felt like Catholicism was on its way down. I wasn't really. They tried to defeat Spain. They tried to take over Spain, but were unsuccessful. But they established that England was going to be its own independent thing, and be its own Protestant culture. And so was Germany, what would eventually become Germany, I mean. So we're well into this new sort of era of the world by the time we get to Shakespeare. But he's very interested in these questions. He's interested in questions of good and evil as well, and the individual. And I think it's because of that his characters are so much more well realized than people who had come before him. Okay, in the next video, we're going to watch a couple of videos on Shakespeare. I'll talk about them, and we'll just talk about Shakespeare in general, who he was, why we value him, what's his place in the world. All right, see you in that video.